Okay, we are going to do the bouncing ball assignment. And to start off, I am using the ball rig that you guys should be able to find through Canvas or in the assignment page that I released with this. I mentioned it as well. So I'm using this rig because I like that I can do the squash and stretch with the rotation control being independent of that squash and stretch, because most of the other ones, bouncing ball rigs that we've seen, have the squashing component isn't independent of the rotation. So the squash and stretch and the rotation happen in the same axis, which can be a little annoying. But I mean, they all have their pros and cons. So I just went ahead and brought in this file. I switched my workspace from Maya Classic to Animation. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I go into my render settings by clicking on the little running man with the gear icon, or I can find this under Windows, Settings and Preferences, Time Slider. We're going to make sure it's 24 frames per second, and we're going to come down here and make sure playback speed is either, it might be different in different versions, but in the version I'm in, 2020, it's 24 frames per second times 1. Okay, then I'll click Save. All right, so I should be all ready to go. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure I have my graph editor pulled up right here. I'm going to set my endpoint for my animation down here. And so this should be visible if you turned on the animation workspace, but you can turn this stuff on as well underneath Windows UI elements, and there's time slider and range slider. And it's going to give you all this. And I also like to have the help line turned on too, which isn't on by default with animation. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to set this to maybe something like 80. Let's set that one to 80 as well. So that'll be my time range. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to be animating a ball bouncing, dropped from a height, bounce forward, and keep bouncing until it loses its energy and then rolls to a stop. Okay. I'm not going to go too in depth breaking this down just for the sake of this exercise being in a reasonable amount of time. But it's recommended that anytime you're doing any animation, you find references. So I found this great playlist of bouncing ball video reference videos by this person right here. It might be an organization, I'm not sure, but they have various videos that people have uploaded of someone dropping a ball and letting it bounce. And so these are really important to you can work with, something someone else has created or create your own, just to see, like, the energy, the weight, the elasticity of different objects and how they move through space. And something as simple as a ball is actually rather challenging, or can be very varied depending on what type of ball it is. If you compare like this small ball that's bouncing, how many times that bounces and how high, versus this basketball, which literally bounces like twice, you can get some very different behaviors from what seems like a very obvious or simple object to work with. Okay, back into Maya. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to change my perspective view to a side view. So I'm going to come in here and go to Panels, Panels, Orthographic, and we're going to do a side view. Or actually, let's do a front view. Panels, Orthographic, Front View. So the x-axis is going from left to right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start this off at a value of, we're going to essentially get the bouncing going first, the translation and the bouncing of the object up and down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start on frame 1 of my animation, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this up to a number like 10. So let's just go ahead and do 10. Okay. For the most part, I'm going to try to keep whole numbers if I can, just because it'll make it easier for me to copy paste them and remember them. Once I have my first keyframe selected on my first frame, or my first pose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go key, set key. Or I'm going to press S on my keyboard for setting key, or I'll come over here, right click, and say key selected or key all. So key all keyable, or if I just want to key only a single, or set a keyframe for a single attribute, I can just right click and say key selected. So I'm just going to press S on my keyboard. That's probably what I do most of the time, is just pressing S. Okay, so this is where I'm going to start with my animation. And I wasn't mentioning this before, but I am working with my this translate control right here. So this rig doesn't have very many controls. It has these squash controls. It has this squash direction control, which is going to change the direction that the squash is going to happen. But then we also we're mostly going to be primarily working with our translate control right here, which is going to move our ball through space and also control its rotation. So I just move this up, and we're going to start from dropping the ball from a height, and it's going to bounce several times until it comes to a rest. Each time that it bounces, it's going to lose some energy. So the first bounce, it's going to be up high, and then once it hits the ground again, it loses some energy. It's going to come back, but not quite as high. Comes back down, loses some energy, comes up not quite as high, and each time it does that, it loses some energy until the ball eventually stops. Okay, and I'm also treating translate y0 as my floor. So whenever I want to have it hit the floor, I want to have it bring it down to the value of 0. So we're starting from 1 at a height of 10. I'm going to come forward to 8, maybe 10 frames, and I'm going to go ahead and grab this translate y value. I'm going to set this down to 0. Okay, so at frame 10, it comes back and hits the ground. And now it's going to need to pop back up for that second bounce. So for the second bounce, it's not going to go quite as high, right? We want it at the first bounce is at frame 10, and then up here at the height of the next bounce, it's going to be a little bit lower. We also have to keep in mind that it's also going to have to happen in a shorter period of time, right? Because if I was having this bounce up, let's say this is like the 5th bounce, and we're going to go right here. And let's say this was also taking about, well, technically this is 9 frames. But if this is taking 9 frames right here, then that's going to go strangely slow, right? So you'll see when it plays back, right, it doesn't have the same speed or velocity on that second bounce because it's going a shorter distance, but in the same amount of time as that first bounce. So it's not going to be quite as physically accurate. So we're going to have this second bounce, or each time we have this bounce, we're going to have it happen a little bit faster so that the bounces kind of have the same speed or velocity or energy to them. So they're not going to be able to go quite as high, but we still want them to have the same kind of speed to them. You don't want them to suddenly feel slower every time it bounces up. One other thing I'm also working with is I'm using auto keyframe. Let's come over here. So I came over frame 10, brought translate y down to 0, and let's say we're going to jump forward to frame 8. So it took 9 frames from the beginning. This time it's going to take 8 frames, so we're going to come to frame 18, and I'm going to go ahead and set this translate y value to something like 8.5. Okay. So normally when I set this, I would have to set a keyframe manually by pressing S on my keyboard or right-clicking and setting a key selected, or going into the key right here. Another thing I can do is there's this button down here called auto keyframe toggle. And when I turn that on, anytime I move an attribute that has any keyframes on it somewhere, so you can see these have a keyframe somewhere on them because they're light pink. Whenever I move that attribute, you'll see it's going to actually set a keyframe for that attribute as soon as I change it. So let's say I'll move this down a little bit, and then let's set this back to 8.5. 8.5. Okay. And so that automatically sets a keyframe for me. Okay, so we have our first bounce, and if you want to kind of get a sense of if the speed feels the same, what you can do is you can come in here, look at it in the graph editor, and see if the slope of this these lines on either side are the same. If this one is significantly steeper like that, you can tell that this is a very different speed than this over here. Or it feels something like that, right? This slope is pretty steep, this slope is pretty shallow, so that tells me this is going to be a very different speed. So that's something you can kind of double check. And also, of course, the best way to check is just playing back your animation for yourself and seeing what it looks like. So we have this coming down, going back up, and then so this is just the nature of things if you throw them up in the air, right? Just like a physics kind of assessment, where if you take a ball or anything that you can carry in your hand, or really anything, and if you throw it up in the air, what it's going to do is it's going to have an initial velocity going upwards, right, up into the sky, but gravity is constantly deaccelerating it, right, at a rate of, I think, 9.8 meters per second. It's been a while since I've taken a physics class, so I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So it's having a downward deacceleration, or I guess downward acceleration, of 9.8 meters per second, which means it's slowing down as it gets up into the sky until it reaches a point where it slows down to a stop. So it stops going upwards. And then it's going to re-accelerate, or I guess just accelerate back down to the Earth. And let me see, this is 8, this will be 26. So let's just go ahead and I'll just manually set this. So you can see it goes up, and it deaccelerates as it's going upwards. And then it's going to start accelerating back down towards the ground until it hits the ground, right? And so that arc going from initial velocity deaccelerating to 0 and then accelerating from 0 back to a velocity, those values in a theoretical sense should be the same. So its velocity coming off the ground and its velocity when it's about to hit the ground should pretty much be the same. And it should take pretty much the same amount of time to go up as it does to come down. So that's just a nature of working with this theoretical, problem of throwing an object up into the sky and measuring what happens is that its initial speed and end speed should be the same, but just in opposite directions. And the time it takes to reach the peak of its upward trajectory to the time it takes for it to come back down to the ground should be the same. So we're going to use that principle for working with a lot of this. We're going to make sure that this is going to, whenever we pop it off the ground, goes up, slows down, comes to a stop, and comes back down, in that arc of up to down, we're going to make sure that that takes the exact same amount of time on both of those stages. Okay, so let's go ahead and play this out. So let's go ahead and get all of our bounces first, and we'll come back because you probably already can tell that it doesn't look quite right. All right, so that first bounce, it was only half a bounce, so we're not really worrying about how long it took for the most part, but it took 9 frames in this case, came from a height of 10. And then the second bounce, it's happening in 8 frames, or that, where it took 9 frames, it took 8 frames for the upwards and 8 frames for the downwards. And it only went up to about 8.5, or you could do 8. Okay, and so now this next one, we're going to have it come up to maybe 6. So I'm going to have this, and I'll go ahead and have this come up 6 frames. So we'll go ahead and go to 32, which is 6 frames later. And we'll go ahead and set this up to maybe something like 6 or 5.5. We might adjust these values later. 6, and we'll go forward 6 more frames, 38, and we'll set this back down to 0. Okay, the next one, let's do 4. So this is going to be 42 frames forward, and we'll set this up to like maybe 4. I'm just kind of working with these values because they're easy. And then we're going to come out over to 46, and we'll set this back down to 0, so it comes back to the ground. Remember, the amount of time it takes to go up needs to be the same as it going down. Okay, I'm going to come in here. I'm going to press F to inside the graph editor so I can kind of see what's happening. We're starting to see kind of a pattern going on here, right? It's taking less time for each bounce. The shape of the curves are pretty much the same, like the slope, right? Which is a good sign. We can tweak it later. And we can see that it's losing energy or height each time that hits the ground. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do 3 frames. So we'll come over to 49, and let's go ahead and set this up 2.5 or 3. Okay, and we'll do 3 more, so that's going to be 52. We'll set this back down to 0. And we'll go forward 2 frames, and then we're going to set this maybe 1.5. 2 more frames, 0. And we're going to go forward 1 frame. And this one will be, hopefully I didn't skip any numbers, I might have. We'll go forward 1 frame, we'll set this to like 0.8, I guess. And then we'll come forward another frame, bring it to 0. And we'll do that one more time, where we'll go forward a frame, and we'll set this to like 0.4. And then we'll set this, go forward 1 more frame and set to 0. So that last part's going to be like kind of like a really quick wiggle at the end. And I might go ahead and bring the end of this down to 60. So I'm just clicking and dragging on this little end bar inside my time range slider, just so that I can kind of bring my working area down to the end of that animation. And I can just go ahead and play it back. Okay. And I might want an extra bounce at the end, and I'll definitely give it some time so it can kind of come to a rest. And that's also why we have this going longer than 60. Okay, Let's go ahead and add one more bounce at the end. So I'll come down here, move forward one frame. I think the last one I did was 0.4. We'll do this last one, 0.15. Okay, and the last one, or the very end, 0. And that'll be when it stops bouncing. Okay, so let's go ahead and drag this to the end, 62, and I'll go ahead and play this back. So each bounce, it loses some energy until it eventually stops bouncing. And I can see it. Let me just go ahead and drag that a little bit further. Okay. All right, so one thing you might notice from looking at this is that it feels a little weird. It feels a little floaty, right? It kind of feels like this ball is at the end of like a stick or something like that, and someone is lifting it up and down. And the reason why it feels kind of weird and floaty is that if you play this back, and what we can do is we can come in here and let's look at this at the animation settings. We can come back in here and we'll do half speed, 24 frames per second times 0.5. Save. We can play that back, and it's going to go slower. One thing you might notice, or you might not notice if you're kind of new to this kind of stuff, but let me go ahead and I'll turn off NURBS curve, so we're just looking at the ball. You might notice this or you might not, but the ball is slowing down as it reaches the ground. So before it actually touches the ground, it's actually slowing down, which is weird because in real life, what that would mean is that the ball is somehow able to provide lift or upward momentum to itself to kind of prevent itself from hitting the ground at full speed, right? Or as if the ball knew that it was about to hit the ground, which doesn't make sense, right? In reality, if you drop something, it's going to keep accelerating until it hits terminal velocity, which isn't going to happen in this case, or until it hits something, right? It's going to keep speeding up, keep speeding up, keep speeding up until it hits something that stops it from, continuously falling. And so that downward deacceleration should make this keep going at a faster and faster speed. But we can see right here that if this is our translate y value, so I have my control selected, and I'm coming down here to my, if you unselected it by accident, you can just re-show the NURBS curve and click on it. But I'm just going to turn that off just so we can see the ball. So I'm going to take this translate y value, and we can see this in our graph editor, where the x-axis is time, or the frame number, and the y-axis is going to be the value of our current attribute. So in this case, it's going to be the upwards and downwards position of our object, which is the translate y value. So we can see that as time goes on, from this, let's go ahead and focus just on these guys right here. So I'll just select this frame right here. I'm gonna press, okay, let's select both of them. It's kind of hard to see. I'll select both of those and press F on my keyboard. So you'll see that starting off, the Y value isn't changing. So this is the Y value, isn't changing that much between frames, right? It's actually changing very, very little. So you can see it's actually just a 0.4 or 0.35 value change, right? But you'll see as we get further along, this change is much more significant, right? So you can see this right here is like a 1.3 value change. So we can see the rate of change is actually increasing right in here. And we can kind of visually see that. Let me go ahead and just frame everything, right? You can see that where it starts off pretty flat, and then it gets a pretty steep slope, and then we notice that it flats out again, right? Which means that at the very end of this keyframe, it's actually slowing down the Y rate of change. And so there's less of a rate of change, which means that it's deaccelerating and moving at a slower pace, as you guys might expect. Okay, and so that just has to do with how Maya is automatically handling these keyframe interpolations. So that keyframe interpolation, so we essentially told Maya what our poses are, and then Maya just tries to figure out how it moves between them. And it's adding this automatic ease in and ease out, which you're noticing from this auto splines tangent right here, or auto tangents. So if I came in here, I could come in here and I can do linear, right? So you can see right here, there is no acceleration or deacceleration or ease out and ease in. It's just a constant value changing from, or it's just a constant rate of change between each keyframe. And I'll play this back. You can see this looks a little weird. Feels very robotic, right? It's like, it doesn't have like that slow in at the top, right? Where it just kind of immediately goes in the next direction. And we can go back in here and let's set that to 24 frames per second times 1. Right, so it feels very, very robotic and artificial. Okay, so by changing how these keyframes interpolate between one another with what's called their tangents, or manipulating their tangents, is how we can really refine the quality of our movement and make it feel more accurate or more what we want. So by default, Maya's using this auto tangents right here. Okay, so this auto tangents is kind of nice at the beginning, right? Because when we bounce up, we want it to de-accelerate, slow down to a stop, right? We want this ease out, and then we want it to ease in back into accelerating downwards. But the part we don't like is that it slows down before it hits the ground, which I don't like. I would like it to have a pretty constant or accelerating speed before it hits the ground, right? Not actually trying to slow out. So what I want to do is I want to select this bottom keyframe right here. We're going to go ahead and change this to a different type of tangent. We're going to change this to linear. By switching it to linear, what it does is it removes that ease in and ease out. So we come here, and it's actually, in this case, it's still not quite right, but it's better than it was before. So let's go ahead and bring this down to, set that down. We'll bring this down to this frame right here. Okay. So I'll just go ahead and play this back. So what it's doing now is it's not slowing down before it hits the ground, but it's still not quite right, because you can see here that the speed that it's at which it's hitting that that ground right there is actually just gets to kind of a constant value, right? So at a certain point, it hits a constant value. It doesn't speed up anymore. So it's better than it slowing down, right? Because that didn't feel quite right. But it should still be keep speeding up as it gets closer and closer to the floor, right? Or to the ground. So I can fix this by grabbing my keyframe. We have these tangent handles, right? These guys right here, and you just click and drag them on either side. And what they'll do is you can move them with the move tool. So just select the move tool, and I can either click and drag on the little keyframe handle, or I can middle mouse click and drag off of it to manipulate the curve. And so you'll see what I can do is I can drag that in a way that it shapes this curve so it has this acceleration, and it's actually going to keep speeding up until it hits that point right there. And now when I play this back, it's going to be weird at the end of it, but it's going to feel much better coming into the ground. But the problem with that is when I move one side, it's going to affect the other, which isn't quite what I want, right? Because I want this to hit the ground at this constantly, or this rapidly accelerating speed, bounce off, and I want it to come out with this pretty much the same exact speed as it came in, and then rapidly slow down as it goes higher and higher into the air. So in order to do that, what we have to do is we have to break these tangents away from each other, because right now they're locked. If I choose to change one side, it's going to change the other. So in order to do that, what I want to do is I'm going to select that keyframe, and there's actually a button here, right here, so you can see these are unified tangents, and I'm seeing this down here. It says unified tangents. I'm going to click on this, and it's going to say break tangents. We can also find this under, go in here, and you can break your tangents. And so what that does is it lets me manipulate a tangent on one side of the keyframe without affecting the other one. So we can go ahead and drag this over so that we have this really slow acceleration downwards, and it's going to speed up, speed up, speed up, hit the ground, and we want it to bounce back up. So I'm going to grab this keyframe on the other side, and I'm going to just try to mirror it as the same as the other one. Okay. You'll see I don't want to drag it too high, because you can see it actually it'll bounce up, and then it'll go higher, then go lower, then go higher again. It's going to be really weird. It's going to have like a weird midair wiggle. Same thing if I did it like here, right? Let's go ahead and play that back. So it goes up and then comes down. This one goes up and then comes down and then stops and then goes down again. So you got to be careful. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring this so it doesn't quite get flat, but it gets close. All right, and then now we're going to play this back. So you can see that feels much better. It feels like it's actually like bouncing off the ground, like it hits and it pops back up. And this playback might be a little slow if you're watching it. Just from me recording it, it's kind of going a little choppy. And if your playback is ever slow, what you can do is you can come in here on your computer if it's slow. You can go in here and do playback speed, play every frame, save. and it's going to go way too fast on mine. But if yours is like a really has a hard time processing your scene, or it's really slow, you can use that to kind of get your animation to play back more smoothly. Because if you're playing back 24 frames per second, but your computer is having a hard time keeping up, what it's going to do is it's actually going to skip frames, and so you'll actually not see your whole animation because it's trying to maintain a constant speed. Okay, cool. So this shape right here is kind of what I want to do with the rest of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and drag this back out so we can see all these. I'll press F for framing with none of them selected. I'm just going to drag that time slider back to the start and end. And I'm just going to grab all these bottom keyframes, not that one. And well, I might have to hold Control Shift and grab these ones. There we go. And I don't want this one. And the movement is actually pretty similar. Like a lot of the tools in here in terms of moving and manipulating things is pretty similar to how it works inside of the viewport, right? So I can hold Alt middle mouse click to kind of move around, and I can zoom in and zoom out and press F or A to do any type of framing. All right, so with all those keyframes there selected, and I'm using the same selection tools I would in the 3D view, with like Shift and left clicking and Control Shift to add. So what I'm going to do is, with all those selected, I'm going to go ahead and set them to linear tangents. So it's going to give me a good starting point. So I'll add those to linear tangents. So the bottom of all these bounces is not going to have a slow in and slow out. And so what we're going to do is now we're going to select all those tangents again. So I'm just holding Shift, clicking and dragging over all these guys. And we're going to go ahead and break their tangents so that we can manipulate the left side and the right side of each floor bounce keyframe. We're going to come here, go to tangents, break tangents. Okay. Now I'm just going to go ahead and manually come in here and drag these to get the kind of that upside down bowl shape, or that bell curve kind of look to it. And I'll just select each one of these. Each one's going to need a slightly different kind of angle to it to get the right shape. I'm just coming right below it getting flat. I don't really want it to get flat because it's going to feel like it hangs in the air in a really weird way. I'm just trying to get it right below that. We're really kind of just accentuating the physics of this, right? It's going to be a little bit more punchy and snappy than it probably would be in real life, but it'll have that kind of physical feeling to it. So let's go ahead and pull that up. All right, these ones are getting pretty slow and pretty low. Let's grab that one. And let's grab this one. And this one is so subtle that I might not even mess around with that one that much. All right, so let's go ahead and play this back. That's feeling pretty good. Let's drag that down a little bit. So it feels really bouncy, like it feels like it might be made of some kind of rubber, because it's having a lot of bounces, right? And it's not losing that much energy. This is kind of similar to a, like you would expect, like a bouncy ball or a tennis ball or maybe even a ping pong ball. So it has a lot of like bounce and give to it that lets it kind of get a lot of air and get a lot of bounces out of it without losing too much energy, compared to something like a soccer ball or a basketball. Or something else that's not quite as dense but pretty large and filled with air, and which will probably not bounce quite as many times by itself without some kind of outward force. Okay, and so by changing those this shape so that it has like this kind of slower acceleration and deceleration at the top, it kind of hangs in the air a little bit more, and then making sure that when it hits the ground, it has that really snappy punch in and back out. Makes it feel very physical and believable. So that's the first step, and that's looking pretty good. Let's move on to the next step. So for the next step, we're going to add another physical element to this to make the material, again, feel a little bit more physical and realistic. And what that is we're going to take advantage of this ball rig's squash and stretch behavior. This isn't something that is necessarily always going to be true to real life. Like you're not going to be animating every single object and you're going to have to do some kind of squash and stretch. So it's more of something that's just kind of popular within like stylized or cartoony character rigs and animation. And it does happen in real life. And so I think as we're going to take advantage of that just so we can get a little bit more experience animating and manipulating different attributes. But it's also going to give this another quality to this little ball that's going to be kind of fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be working with this control right here. And so this is going to be my squash and stretch control from the top, right? So when it hits the ground, I want it to kind of stick and plant in the ground. So I'm not going to mess around with the bottom one that much. And we're just going to have the top compress and then spring back up, right? And we're going to leave this one right here kind of alone. So in order to do this, what we're going to do is I'm actually going to make a few modifications to this. I'm going to go ahead and take my animation, and I'm going to go ahead and give myself a little bit of time on the first two bounces for my animation to, or my ball to kind of hit the ground and stick to the ground a little bit, because we're going to really accentuate the first squash and the second squash. And then everything else after that's just going to be very subtle, because we want us to feel like, imagine taking like a dodgeball and then chucking it or launching it against a like brick wall, right? You would imagine that it would compress quite a bit from the force of that throw, like you threw it as hard as you could. But if you just kind of like gently dropped it, right, you would imagine that it probably wouldn't change shape that much. It would give a little wiggle, but it probably wouldn't be like squashing that much. So we're going to be kind of doing that where the first couple bounces, like the first two bounces, it's really falling from a height that's going to give it like a really strong speed. But the other ones, it's not going to hit quite the same speed. So we're not going to be worrying too much about that squash on those ones. So what I'm going to do is, and I might change this a little bit, I'm kind of playing this by ear, is I'm going to give this my ball a little bit of time on the ground. So let's see, we're going to give it 2 more frames for it to stay on the ground. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my keyframes here, and let's go ahead and drag the in slider a little bit further. And I'm going to go ahead and with the move tool selected, I'm going to go ahead and hold shift and middle mouse click and drag it to the sideways. And so while holding shift is going to lock it, so I'm not going to move it up and down, which is going to be great. If I don't do that, if I just middle mouse click and drag, you can see it can kind of start to get off a little bit. Like I only want to move it forward, I don't want to move it up and down. The other thing I could do is I could of course just hold shift, select all of these keyframes in the time slider, and then just drag it forward 2 frames too. So there's multiple ways we can do this. So I'm just going to have move tool, shift, middle mouse click and drag it to the right 2 frames. Okay, this is going to give me a little extra time to let this stick on for 2 frames on the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this keyframe, and we're going to go ahead and right click, or actually let's come over here. I'll right click on the keyframe in the time slider right here. We're going to copy, we're going to go forward 2 frames, we're going to paste it. Okay, so it'll hit the ground and then stay on the ground. But we are seeing a problem here where it's sticking it's not sticking on the ground, it's actually popping back up, and that's because of the default auto tangents. The auto tangents is trying to build in like this nice little kind of curve to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I can go ahead and either click on this button right here, which is going to be flatten tangents, or let's grab this one. Let's see if we can do it that way. So we'll just select the keyframe and we'll select one side of the tangents and we'll go ahead and flatten it out. There you go. So I'll keep it from popping up like that. Okay, so it's going to come down, stick, and then pop back up. And so right now it looks a little weird, but it'll look better once we mess around with that squash. We might need to play with the timing a little bit. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and work with this squash and stretch. So I'm going to go ahead to the first keyframe. I'm going to press S on my keyboard to set a keyframe. And we're going to come down to right before it hits the ground. And what we're going to do is we're going to be accentuating the acceleration of this object, right? And so this might not be super believable in real life with most materials, but I think this is going to kind of enforce the physical feel of this object like it's like a much softer material. And you'll see this if you look at something like a water balloon. If you know, a water balloon might be fairly spherical, but when you take it and you chuck it at a high speed, because of the material's elasticity being a little weaker than the weight of the material inside of it, it's going to kind of stretch out like this as it goes faster and faster and faster, because the material is like struggling to keep up with dragging that weight with it, right? So it's a little exaggerated, but it'll be kind of a fun effect. So we'll go ahead and as it falls and picks up speed, it's going to stretch out a little bit, and we can maybe accentuate it just a little bit. Let's set this. I'm going to go ahead and set this to like 0.65. Okay. Stretches out, and then at the when it pops off the ground again. Oh, let's go ahead and break down one at a time. So I'm going to go forward a frame, and we're going to go ahead and squash this down below. So we're going to get a little bit of squash. Maybe not. We're not going to go crazy with it, but we're going to bring it down to something like a negative 0.5. Okay. So it comes down, squashes, and we're going to want it to pop back up, right? So, and what we're simulating here is the ball hits the surface, right here, but because this is an elastic material, the ball isn't going to immediately, like, imagine this is rubber versus something like stone or glass, right? If you imagine you threw something against a wall that was made of stone or glass, the object would just immediately stop, right? Because the material is so rigid. But with something that's really elastic or giving, like rubber, what's going to happen is the front hits the wall, and that part's going to stop, but the momentum of the rest of the object is going to overcome the material's elasticity and move forward. So the rest of the ball is still moving forward, even though the front of it's kind of stopped. And you can see it kind of like balloon out or kind of deform and preserve its volume that way. And then it reaches a certain point where the elasticity of the material is pushing back like a spring, and then at a certain point the energy is going to be lost going this way, and the spring is going to launch it back the other way. So that's what we're doing. We're having it come into the it stops moving like the whole ball, right? It stops kind of like moving through space, and the back half of the ball is still coming forward and pushing that ball and deforming it until it loses enough energy moving forward that it accelerates it back the other way like a spring. Okay, and I've messed up that keyframe because I have auto keyframes turned on. So it squishes in, and maybe we'll have it go a little bit more, and then at frame 12, we're having it snap back out. So we're going to set this to 0.65, I think it is. Okay, and so comes in, squishes, hits the ground, squishes, and pops back up. And it might be moving too much, or we might even need like maybe another frame. I might give it another frame, and then it pops back up. And at the height of its next arc, we want this to be back to being a normal shape, right? Because it's not colliding in with anything, and it's lost all of its momentum, so it kind of goes back to its normal shape. Stretches, squishes, bounces, and maybe it's too much. I think let's bring that down a little bit. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So let's take a look at this curve. I'll come in here. So what I'm going to do is, what we have is we actually have it hit the ground, and then it's kind of slowly easing in, so it accelerates in, and then it eases back out. So essentially accelerates in, comes to a stop, accelerates back forward again. And so what I want to do is I want to maybe play around with this curve a little bit. So I might select both of these. I'll go ahead and go to tangents, break tangents. I'll grab both of these inner handles, and we're just going to go ahead and set this to linear. And so that's just going to kind of speed up when it hits the ground, that it's going to carry that energy, right? Because it feels kind of weird that it's kind of slowing into it and then slowing back out. I'm going to let it, when it hits the ground, it's carrying that energy all the way through that bounce. Okay. And so let's go ahead and hide those NURBS surfaces. Oh, sorry, NURBS curves. So you'll see on that first bounce, right? You see all these other bounces, it feels very rigid and hard. like maybe like a really thick or hard like golf ball or something like that. And on that first one, it feels really elastic and bouncy, right? You see it kind of stretching, and it's very subtle. It happens within like the matter of like 2 or 3 frames, but it has a big effect on it. So we're really only going to do that for the first 2 bounces because the rest of them are going to be not quite that dramatic. Okay. So we're going to come back out here. Let's go ahead and go to Show, NURBS Curves. We'll select that curve again. Okay. I'm going to do this on the next bounce. And this next bounce, I also want to stick to the ground a little bit. Right? Not quite as long as the other one, but a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add another keyframe after this bounce right here. So they can stick on the ground at least for 2 keyframes instead of 3 keyframes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all these other keyframes. I'm going to move them forward. So select the Move tool, hold Shift, middle mouse click and drag over 1 frame. And I'm going to come over here and we're going to copy this keyframe. So I'm going to right click, copy. We'll move forward a frame, paste. Okay, come back in here. We'll grab these keyframe handles on the inside, and we're just going to do that flatten. So we'll flatten it out so it doesn't wiggle in between. We want to just stick to the ground when it gets in there. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hold Shift because I kind of want to look at both of these guys. I'm going to hold Shift and select both this control, both the Squish control and the Translate control. And I'm going to select both of their Translate Y values. So I'm just selecting just the Translate Y values. So what I'm going to do is with that, what we can do is we can go in here, we can turn off this button right here, which is Auto Load Graph Editor. So you see that? I'm going to turn that off so that now I can just select just the this control, right? And it's not going to unselect. If I didn't have that on, what I'll do is if I selected this control, it'd unselect the Translate control. And the only reason why I want to do this is because I kind of want to see my where my animation and my keyframes of the main control are to help me with my Squish control. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go ahead and with that Squish control selected, I'm going to go ahead and choose right here. We're going to go ahead and set it to a higher value, maybe not 0.65, maybe something like 0.5, maybe not, so not as quite as intense as the other one. Just like how we're losing energy bouncing, we're not going to have quite as drastic of a squash each time. And I'll come over to the maybe 3 frames. So I'm going to come over 2 frames. So 1, 2, and we're going to set this back to 0.5, and we'll set a keyframe for that. So we'll just go ahead and press S. Okay. And then in between those 2 keyframes, we're going to go ahead and get a negative squash. Not as high as the other one, and so I can look at this and just make sure it's not quite as high. So let's set that to just so we can keep up with whole numbers, or as close to whole numbers as we can. 3.6 or 3.5. Oh, never mind. 0.35. I say whole numbers, but I just mean trying to get rid of extraneous. What's it called? Fraction or decimal points. So you'll see there's a little bit of a problem here because this happened. The bounce is the bounce of the main ball moving up and down is happening over 2 frames, but my squash is happening over 3 frames. And it probably is happening fast enough that nobody's going to notice, but we're going to actually move this in between frames. So what I'm going to do is with this selected, I'm going to go ahead and grab both of these guys, and I'm going to actually scale this in. You want to be careful doing this kind of stuff because what'll happen is you're actually moving your keyframes in between frames of your film. And that's not a problem. Like Maya can handle that just fine, but it gets a little messy when you want to manipulate and move things around. Is if you have keyframes happening between frames, it gets a little hard to select those and isolate those. So you gotta be careful. But for this case, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and turn on the scale tool. And with my time slider at the first frame, I'm gonna hover over it. I'm gonna hold Shift, middle mouse click, and we're just gonna drag this in until that last keyframe is overlapping with the other one. And I might have to do one quick fix. Let's go ahead and fix this really quickly. Okay, so I misremembered how I was doing this in the past, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do this in the, so what it does is it tries to automatically snap your keys to whole numbers, which is great, right? It tries to keep it on actual frames instead of putting it in between your frames. But I kind of want to work around it for just this situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in the time slider, so you can get around with this in the time slider. So I'm going to hold Shift, left click and drag up to maybe like 32 or 34. And then if I click on any of these endpoints, it'll let me scale my keyframe selection. So it'll make it smaller or bigger. So what I do is with those selected, I'm going to come in here to the right side. I'm going to scale this down, and looking at here, I'm going to try to get it so that this first keyframe lines up with the end of the ball's main bounce, and that last keyframe ends with the beginning of the next bounce. So I just kind of drag those, and I'm just shift selecting and then clicking and dragging the endpoints to scale them around. So again, I don't know if I wouldn't consider this best practice, moving your keyframes in between frames, but for this purpose, I think it's going to be simple enough that we don't have to worry about it. All right, so once again, what we have is at the end of this bounce, it goes back to being the stretch mode, but when it gets to the height of that arc right there, I want it to be back down to its neutral shape. So let's set this to 0. Okay. Let's see, go here. It should have its keyframe. So let's see, right there, let's set that to 0. And I'll just go ahead and set the key manually by pressing S. Oh, I did something wrong. I think I had something selected, so let's go ahead and go back in there, set that to, let's go make sure it's at the right keyframe. Set that to 0. And I'll go ahead and press S. Okay, I'm doing something really wrong. All right, let me go ahead and fix this really quickly. Okay, I think the issue I was having was, let me go ahead and Control Z this back. I'll just delete this keyframe, or let's Control Z this back until I scaled it. So I think this scaling method is just too messy for Maya. Maya doesn't really like it. So I brought this back so that my keyframes were somewhere in here, but the problem is this keyframe right here isn't quite on a frame, right? You can see it's not quite lining up with frame 29. So then what happens is when I go up to frame 35, deselect that and set this to frame 0, or value 0. Oh, okay, never mind. I cleared something up. Maya didn't like something about what I had done something earlier, but apparently what I thought was wrong was not what was actually wrong. I thought I had to actually get this last keyframe on an actual frame. I'm not sure. I'm sorry, guys. I wish I knew what the heck was going on with Maya sometimes. So I got this second bounce, right? And I'll play this back. And so it's pretty good. I think the only issue is that it feels a little weird that it can, let's go to nerves curves. I'll play this back. So in that second bounce, it feels like it's a little bit too stretchy for how fast it's going. Like it's not going quite fast enough to make this middle part, right? There's a part right in here where it feels like it's stretching too much, right? And it really isn't giving, it doesn't really have the speed to make that make sense. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and play around with that translate Y curve right here so it doesn't quite hit that stretch value so quickly. So you can see right around here, frame 23 or 24, is it's starting to stretch out quite a bit. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and select these curves. We're gonna go ahead and break our tangents, or our keyframes, sorry. Select these keyframes and we're gonna break the tangents, there we go. We're going to go ahead and select the inner ones, and we'll do a linear. And we'll select the outer ones, and maybe we'll select the outer ones and do a linear. That's looking pretty good. And if I don't want that to stretch quite so soon, I can drag this down so it remains unstretched for a longer period of time. So you can see it's going to be pretty much unstretched until it starts picking up speed, and then it'll start stretching out. And I can do the same thing on the other side as well. Okay, and so now you can see it's mostly round for the beginning, and I might even need to do this even more. There we go. I have to be careful on this one because it's like counter stretching. So you can see there, it's not quite deforming so much at this slow part right here. And we'll play that back. And that bounce is happening just between those frames, so we're probably not even really going to see it. If I wanted to, what I could do is, yeah, actually, I just realized that was kind of silly, that we're not really going to be able to see that second bounce because that squash, because it's in between frames, and we're not seeing those frames. So I'm leaving this in because I want you guys to see that why that doesn't work, and have that make sense a little bit, and because I thought that I could have that bounce in between frames, but that's kind of pointless because if it's in between frames, we're not going to see that frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and give this the same time as this one right here. So I'll grab all these keyframes going up to this one. We're going to drag it forward one more, right? If we wanted to, we can also make the other one maybe last another keyframe so that first bounce can stick on the ground just slightly longer. But we're just going to give ourselves enough space in here so there's actually 3 frames so we can see everything. All right, we'll go back to translate Y, and we're going to move these guys forward again. So we're just going to move that forward. I'm going to grab this keyframe, and this one's going to be, I want this to be right when it hits the ground, which is good. And then this one's going to be right before it leaves the ground. So I'll just drag that over there. And this downward squash is going to be in that middle. Okay, so it squashes like that. And now I just want to make sure these values are kind of the same. And we'll fix that in a little bit. So let's select both of these. Let's see, that's 0.35. Let's go ahead and set that, or 375. Let's set that 0.375. And let's make sure this other one is set the same. Or actually, let's set that back to what it was. I think it was 0.5. 0.5. Oops. 0.5. Enter. And this one's going to be 0.5. And then that downward one, that one's okay. Okay. And I'm going to check that curve. It goes under a little bit, so I'm just going to lift that up just a touch. Okay. And now we need to realign this one because you can see it stays on the ground for a split second, which isn't great. So what I'm going to do is it leaves, the last part it's on the ground is at frame 13, then pops up. So I'm going to move this keyframe right here, middle mouse click and drag, forward 1 frame. We can do the same thing for this. We'll just forward click and drag that one frame. Select both of these. Let's select both those handles. Let's make sure they're linear. They are. Okay, that's great. I'm going to go ahead and change the shape of that curve to match these ones over here as well. Okay. And so let's go ahead and play that back. So it's okay. I think what I don't really like, I might go ahead and if I was being really nitpicky, I would maybe not let this be 1, 2, 3, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 frames. But maybe bring this back down to being just happening over 3 frames, just like this one, and just let them be the same. Because you can kind of sense in that first one, it feels a little weirdly blobby, like it's a little too elastic. And what I might do just for the time being is I might just go ahead and make this not deform quite so much on that downward squash. Okay, all right, so let's keep moving on just for the sake of keeping this relatively brief. I'm going to add one last soft squish right here, right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to copy paste these just to kind of save myself some time. So I'm going to go ahead and shift select, shift click and drag these guys. I'll go ahead and copy. I'll go to where it's about to hit the ground. So this one right here isn't going to stick on the ground. It's actually going to bounce right off. So right before it hits the ground, I'm going to go ahead and right click and say paste. Ooh, okay, that was weird. All right, so there's something wrong. All right, there is definitely something wrong with my Maya. And let me go ahead and fix this really quickly. Okay, I had to reopen Maya and it fixed itself. I'm sure there's something silly I was doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to try to copy paste that again. So I'm going to right click copy, come back over here. We're going to go right before it hits the ground right here. We're going to right click and say paste. All right. And it'll happen really quickly and we're going to make this not happen quite so largely, like it's not going to be quite so much of a squash. So I'm going to just hold shift and middle mouse click and drag with the move tool down. So it's not quite squashing as much as it over here. Oop. And we're going to do the same thing down here. Just pull that up a little bit. And at the height, it's going to go back to 0. So we can copy paste this keyframe where I just come in here and set that to 0. So that translate Y 0. There. So now we have 3 squashes and the rest of it, it's not going to be moving fast enough for us to want to have a squash. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and hide those NURBS curves and we'll just play that back. Oh, it's feeling pretty good. I'm still not super into the first bounce, feeling a little too blobby, but I think it's looking pretty good. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're going to go ahead and get our forward movement, right? Because we're wanting this to kind of be like thrown forward. So what we're gonna do is, this is gonna be pretty easy. Let's go ahead and show those NURBS curves. We're just gonna select that main controller. And we're going to have it keep moving forward past the initial point. So we'll go ahead and have this go all the way till maybe, we'll go all the way to the end, but we'll have this end maybe at like frame 78 or something like that. So at frame 78, we're going to come over here and have it stop right around here. And I might pull this back in a second. Let's go ahead and play that back and see how that looks. So it's looking pretty good. The only problem is it feels weird that let's go ahead and take a look at just this translate X attribute. It feels a little weird that it's accelerating. So it's as if in the air, it's actually being pushed forward at an increasing speed, or it has its own sense of locomotion to move forward. So that doesn't make much sense, right? Because if I threw this, if anything, the only thing it would do is slow down, right? So when we were moving up and down, we were worrying about gravity deaccelerating and accelerating it, right? So gravity was slowing it down in the y-axis and then speeding it back up as it went in the opposite direction. But throwing it forward, it's only going to slow down due to friction on the ground and air resistance. Like it's colliding with the air and it's losing speed as it travels. Okay, so but at the beginning it shouldn't be speeding up. So you can see right here it's actually picking up speed and then slowing down. So what we're going to do is we're just going to select this first keyframe and we're going to go ahead and click on linear tangents so that it's going to have a constant speed when it starts. And we'll go ahead and play that back. And I think it's traveling a little too far for my tastes, so I'm just going to select that. And so I can go ahead and go to that last frame right there, and I can, move it back, right? Or I can come here and just bring that value lower, right? This is a translate X value, so how far it moves in translate X. And I can just middle mouse click and drag that back. So you can do either one. Once you get used to it, it feels pretty intuitive to actually just adjust the values inside the graph editor instead of actually having to change the values in the real world. We'll play that back. So that's looking pretty good. A couple things we can do is what's happening here is it's actually skating or sliding on the ground, which doesn't make much sense. But because we're letting our ball stick on the ground, we probably want it to stay still at that moment in those moments. So what I might do is I might come in here and I might grab that translate X value and I'll key selected, come to this end frame right here when it's jumping back off, key selected. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and make sure these are both the exact same value. So we'll just go to frame 10, 2.547, frame 10, maybe we'll do like 2.6. So it moves forward a little bit, but not a lot. So, and it might look kind of weird actually. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like. Yeah, that looks really weird. Let's go ahead and make sure that this is linear. All right, so it's slowing in and out again at the same on those frames again. So we'll go here. So that doesn't feel as bad. I got rid of those slow ease in and ease out or slow in and slow out stuff. But I might just have it kind of move forward a little bit. So it's moving forward just a touch, just so it doesn't feel like it completely stops in its tracks. And I might do the same thing right here when it has that other sticky part. So I'm going to go ahead and keyframe that. And I'll just go to the other side and we'll set this to the same value. So that's 7.8. So we'll set that to 7. Let's set this one to 7.9. We'll grab both of those, and to prevent it from slowing down before it hits that part, we're going to go ahead and set that back to linear. So we'll just make sure all these guys are set to linear. That's good. Okay, we'll come back here and we'll go ahead and play that back. So it sticks a little bit too much on that second one, so I'll come in here and let's see. We'll go ahead and set that to maybe just an 8. Okay. But other than that, I think it's looking fine. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and work with my rotation. So we've got our up and downward movement. We also got our forward movement through space, and we're also going to go ahead and do our rotation. So getting our ball to spin as it's traveling. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to the first frame, and we already have a keyframe here. And this is our, we're going to look at our rotate, what attribute is that? I think it's the Z attribute, okay. So we're going to take a look at the rotate Z. I'll go ahead and come here. You can see there's already a keyframe here for this area right here. I'll just go ahead and delete that keyframe for the Z attribute. And we're going to come over to the end. Well, let's go to maybe right around here. We'll come to right before the end. And I'm just going to go ahead and rotate this a lot. So we're going to rotate it. Remember, 360 degrees is one full rotation. So let's go ahead and do something like, let's just do 1,000. We'll just see what that looks like. Oops, I did the wrong value. Rotate Z. 1,000. Okay. And again, similar to the forward movement, I don't want this to like slowly spin faster and faster. So we're just like that first keyframe. We're going to go ahead and make sure that's linear, so it comes in with a constant speed instead of accelerates. And we'll just go ahead and play that back. And let's go ahead and turn off. What I'll do is I'll select the translate control. We're going to turn off automatic update on the graph editor, so that I can go ahead and deselect it, and it'll still show up here. And we'll go ahead and go show NURBS curves, turn that off. And we'll go ahead and play that back. And it's going backwards. Actually, I want it to go the other way. So let's go ahead and grab this, and we're going to bring it down to the negative values. So we'll just bring this down to here, negative 1,000. Okay. So it has like a forward spin. So maybe it's spinning too much. Like I feel like it's a little bit too spinny at the beginning. That feels a little bit better. The only thing I don't like is that it kind of stops at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull this forward to the end of my animation. So right before it comes to a full stop. So it comes to a full stop at 76. So we'll just go ahead and pull that over to 76. What I might do, and this might take a little finagling, so I might not go super deep on this, but what I might do is I might make that last part right here where it bounces and comes to a stop, maybe, let's go ahead and pull that to, we'll pull that translate up to there, or that rotate up to there. And then for the last part, we'll go ahead and let it rotate a little bit more. We'll grab this one. Let's go ahead and flatten it so that it kind of, what it'll do is it'll spin, slow down to that rotation, or to that last value right there. And then the last part, it'll just kind of do a little final twist at the end. And what we could do is, well, let's go ahead and see what this looks like. So we'll come in here, we'll go show NURBS curves, we'll play that back. Maybe what I might not want is I might not want it to actually come to a complete stop right there. So I might make that maybe a little bit more linear at the end, because it kind of comes to a stop too soon. That's looking pretty good. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give myself slightly more time. So we're going to come in here and set the endpoint to 84. We'll drag that to 84. And what it'll do is it'll come all the way up to here, and then we're going to have it have a little back roll. So if you guys have ever seen like a ball that's rolling to a stop, you'll like roll it forward, and at the very end of the roll, you might get a little rock back because it tries to roll forward a little bit, but the weight and the momentum wasn't enough, or the forward momentum's not enough to counteract the the weight of the object, and so it kind of rocks back onto itself again. And you'll notice this a lot with like if you had like a really large ball, or like maybe even a basketball, you try to roll it forward slowly, there's going to be a point where it stops, it kind of like comes to the last kind of turn and isn't able to complete the turn, and then rocks back onto its center of gravity. So we'll do this on this part right here, where we'll take our translate X right here, all right? And we have our keyframe there, and then it's going to rock back over a couple frames. So we'll just go ahead and bring that back. So we'll go to show NURBS curves, select that control right there, select the worlds, and we'll just go ahead and translate that back a little bit. Okay, cool. So, and maybe that's too much, so we'll go in here. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to select this last keyframe, press F, and we'll just middle mouse click and drag that up. So it's a really subtle move back. There we go. Okay, and we'll also have it counter turn. So it turns forward, comes to a stop, and we might even want it to kind of hold on that frame right there. So this is translate X 19.75. We'll go ahead and make sure this one's 19.75. So it kind of stays in place for just a second. Oh, it's 19.755. Okay. So it's going to stay in place for a second and then rock backwards. Or rock backwards. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and grab that rotate Z. And I pressed F on my keyboard to frame this all. Let's go ahead and frame in on this stuff. I'll go over here. I'll just go ahead and set another keyframe. So key selected. So it kind of stays. And then when it rocks back, it's going to rotate back that way again. Okay. That's probably too much. It doesn't look bad. All right, so we'll go ahead and play that back. So we'll go show NURBS curves. And I need to give myself just a little bit more space. So we'll come in here, maybe give it that 90. And we'll go ahead and play that. And that happens just a little too fast at the end. So I might go ahead and let's go ahead and this is going to be translate X and the rotate Z. So grab the rotate, translate X, rotate Z, press F on my keyboard to frame this all, and we'll just let this happen over maybe 2 or 3 more frames. So we'll just drag that middle mouse click, drag this forward with Shift selected, and that'll happen a lot more gently. Cool. All right, so that's looking pretty good. So in order to submit this and complete this, we have a couple options available to us. We're definitely going to make a play blast, but what we're going to do is we can either play it from this side view, or we can play this from a perspective view. I can click on this, and we can go ahead and go back to our Maya Classic, right? And we can show this off in the 3/4 view. And so in order to do that, what we can do is we can maybe make like a floor object. So I might pull this out, right? I might go ahead and hide the grid by clicking on the grid icon here. And we can go ahead and maybe make this something like a track or a road or something like that right there. And we want to go ahead and frame this similar to how we did the camera move stuff. So we're going to be using the same settings. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the film gate button right here. And we're going to get this into a position where we can clearly see everything for the full animation. Maybe zoom in a little bit. Okay, and get an angle from the side, somewhat to the side, so I can kind of see this. I could do it from the side view. You guys could choose to shoot it from the side view. So perspective or orthographic side view, or actually it's front, sorry, orthographic front view, right? We can't see the floor, so instead of the floor, instead of a plane, what you could do is you can maybe do like a cube, just because it's the plane is one-dimensional, so seen from the side, there's like nothing there. So you could do this and just select that, and then what you can do is just play that back. But we still want to do the same thing we did before. And what I can do is let's select that. And we'll just go ahead and scale that this way. I want to go ahead and turn on the film gate option. Okay, and I'm going to zoom in on this so that it shows the whole thing. Okay. There we go, and that's looking pretty good. So all that's left is what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide anything I don't want to see. So maybe I'll come in here and show NURBS curves, turn that off. What we're going to do is we're going to right click on the time slider. We're going to go ahead and click on the Play Blast options. I want to make sure my format is AVI if I'm on Windows, and I think it is Move or QT. I think it's QT for QuickTime on Mac. I have a video on Play Blast settings, so please go back and watch that if you're confused about any of the settings. I'll do AVI none, quality 100. I'll make sure my display size is set for my render settings. And in my render settings, I am using HD 540 or maybe HD 720, one of the HD formats. Okay, scale set to 1, frame padding you don't have to worry about, and I want to save the file, and we're going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to do this on my downloads folder. We're going to call this one bouncing ball, and you guys should rename it for the assignment sheet requirements. Don't just call it bouncing ball like I am here when you're done. And we're going to go ahead and click Play Blast. Okay, and we'll get our bouncing ball animation back. And so this one's showing the camera frame, but in this case I think it's okay because it just helps us see that floor, and we're not really worrying too much about presentation here. I just want you guys to get this into a video format. Something else, or if you want to turn off the camera framing, you can just click in here, or the film gate, and turn off both of those. And as long as you have display size from render settings set, you don't move the camera, when you click apply and play this back, it should get rid of that film gate on it. The other thing I could do to kind of improve this quality is I could do this at a higher resolution. So I could do HD 1080. And then another thing I can do is I can turn on screen space ambient occlusion, or sorry, not screen space ambient occlusion, anti-aliasing. So it might be hard to notice, but my ball has a little bit of this jaggedness, which is called aliasing. And so you can click on this I think it's subsampling anti-aliasing. Yeah, multi-sample anti-aliasing. And then we'll go ahead and play that back. Okay, now let's go and play blast it. And so this should be a much higher quality. There we go. Cool. And that's all there is to it. You can make this more advanced if you want to have it like bounce off of another object or hit a wall, come back, or if you want to simulate a bunch of different types of balls based on how many bounces they get, how much energy they lose whenever they hit the ground, how much they deform. It's a great exercise of just getting used to setting keyframes and playing with the graph editor and like controlling the quality of your motion. There's a lot of extra exercises that you can build off of with this one. Let me go ahead and bring one of those up. So the next step a lot of people take is there's these ball rigs. So we're working with a ball rig, but there's a lot of rigs that have a ball that has secondary components to it, like an ear or a tail. And it's great for practicing different concepts like follow through or overlapping animation, where you have like different bodies kind of still, reacting to forward momentum and carrying through that. Even the main body stops, the tail still is playing a little catch up and the ears kind of wiggle around. There's a lot of exercises out there for, that's like kind of the next step that a lot of animation students take of going a step further from the ball bouncing, is starting to work on secondary animation and follow through. And then taking it into the next step with like walk cycles and bipedal or character movement and working with actual characters. I hope that this was useful and easy to follow along. If you guys have any questions about how to do this any step of the way, just please let me know if I wasn't clear about anything.